February 6, 1951, Woodbridge, New Jersey. A Pennsylvania Railroad commuter train hits a temporary wooden bridge at about 50 miles per hour. The speed limit was 25. The tracks shift under the weight, the locomotive goes over, and 8 passenger cars follow it down a 26-foot embankment onto the street below. 85 people gone and hundreds more injured. The deadliest train wreck in New Jersey history, and there were no trackside slow order warning signals. The railroad relied on a written bulletin and verbal reminders instead of putting physical signals at the site. The engineer was looking for markers that did not exist. When the Interstate Commerce Commission finished their investigation, the official finding put the immediate cause on one man with 30 years of experience, the engineer who entered the curve too fast. One locomotive, one bridge, one decision to skip the signals. That's all it took. So when people ask how dangerous the case actually was, the locomotive itself was not the underlying problem. The problem was the railroad that ran it into the ground for 40 years, refused to replace it when it became obsolete, and cut every safety corner they could find. This is what happened when corporate negligence met a 234-ton steam locomotive on a curve it should never have taken at speed. In 1914, the Pennsylvania Railroad designed the K4s Pacific. It featured a 462 wheel arrangement, 80-inch drivers, and 205 pounds of boiler pressure. Chief of Motive Power James Wallis built something that could haul 10 passenger cars around Horseshoe Curve and was reported capable of around 100 miles per hour on level track. When the first one rolled out of Juniata shops in Altoona that May, it was impressive. The Pennsylvania Railroad began mass production in 1917. By 1928, they had 425 of them. These machines became the backbone of Pennsylvania Railroad passenger service for 3 decades. They pulled the Broadway Limited, they hauled commuter trains, they moved millions of people. For the first 15 years, they did the job well. By the mid-1930s, passenger trains were getting longer and heavier. The K4s, designed for lighter consists, started struggling. One locomotive could not pull a full express train without losing speed on grades. So the Pennsylvania Railroad started putting 2 K4s on the front of each train, a practice called double-heading. 2 locomotives meant 2 complete crews, twice the coal and twice the maintenance. When that was still not enough, they moved to triple-heading. Meanwhile, the New York Central was running single Hudsons that could do the same job. Other railroads had mountains and northerns that made the K4s look weak. But Pennsylvania Railroad management decided they did not need new steam power because they were focused on electrification east of Harrisburg. For roughly 2 decades, the Pennsylvania Railroad kept running these aging Pacifics in multiple locomotive consists, in part because replacing them would have required serious new investment. Paying 2 or even 3 crews per train was costing them a fortune. Their steam power looked outdated, but the K4s was tried and tested. And that brings us back to Woodbridge. Early February 1951. The New Jersey Turnpike was under construction, and crews needed to work on the main line tracks. The Pennsylvania Railroad installed a temporary wooden trestle near Fulton Street. It went into service earlier that day, on February 6th. The speed limit there was cut from 60 miles per hour to 25 miles per hour. Standard practice on American railroads was to protect slow orders with some kind of warning, flags, lights, or other markers the engineer could see from the cab. At Woodbridge, the Pennsylvania Railroad chose to rely only on a general order and verbal reminders to crews, instead of putting up physical warning signals at the restriction. Instead, they posted a notice on bulletin boards back in January and told engineers verbally, "No signals, no physical warnings." The 733 train leaves Exchange Place in Jersey City around 5. 11 passenger cars follow, pulled by a K4s, number 2445. The engineer is Joseph Fitzsimmons, 58 years old, with 30 years of experience. The conductor is John Bishop, 54. Before they leave, Bishop reminds Fitzsimmons about the speed restriction at Woodbridge. The train is absolutely packed. The Jersey Central Railroad is on strike, so everyone who normally takes their trains is crammed onto Pennsylvania Railroad service. Approximately 1,000 passengers were aboard those 11 cars, according to later estimates and official tallies, with contemporary reports describing extremely crowded conditions. As they approach Woodbridge around 5:40, Fitzsimmons is looking ahead for the signals that should be there. The yellow lights, the warning markers, something to tell him where to start braking. There is nothing. He is running 50 to 60 miles per hour, looking for warnings that do not exist. By the time he realizes he is at the temporary bridge, it is too late. Bishop sees it coming and tries to reach the emergency brake cord, but he cannot get through the crush of passengers. The locomotive hits the curve at more than double the speed limit. The tracks are not secured, just sitting in shallow grooves. When 234 tons of steam locomotive enters that curve doing 55 miles per hour, the rails shift. The gauge widens. Number 2445 goes over. The first cars tip onto their sides, others jackknife and plunge off the embankment, and more end up hanging out over the street below. Some newspapers reported that a few passengers, seeing the dark wet pavement below, mistook it for water and jumped. By the time it stopped, 84 people were gone immediately. 500 people were injured. Fitzsimmons, trapped in the cab with injuries, would never operate a train again. Within days, Pennsylvania Railroad management is pointing fingers. At hearings later that month, company witnesses maintained that excessive speed was the sole cause of the accident, emphasizing that Joseph Fitzsimmons entered the curve too fast. Except the Interstate Commerce Commission started digging deeper. Kenneth Silvey, the Pennsylvania Railroad's own New York Division engineer, testified that the required braking distance to slow from 65 to 25 was nearly double what Pennsylvania Railroad supervisors had established, meaning even if Fitzsimmons had seen warnings at the correct distance, he might not have been able to stop. Then there was the issue of the signals that did not exist. Fitzsimmons told investigators he was looking for trackside markers, standard railroad practice, but Pennsylvania Railroad management had decided those signals were unnecessary. First Assistant Prosecutor Alex Eber later stated that while Fitzsimmons may have been responsible for speeding, the Pennsylvania Railroad bore moral responsibility for not providing proper warning signals at the restriction. Eber suggested in public statements that the circumstances could warrant a manslaughter indictment, according to press coverage at the time. The Public Utility Commission agreed. But by the first anniversary, Eber dropped his prosecution. He argued that legal expenses from a trial would punish taxpayers more than the Pennsylvania Railroad, which could afford a court battle. Civil lawsuits and claims turned Woodbridge into one of the costliest accidents the Pennsylvania Railroad ever faced. Fitzsimmons continued working for the Pennsylvania Railroad until 1953, but he never operated a train again and took early retirement because of his injuries. His wife Grace died a few years later. He eventually remarried, and he lived in Point Pleasant until his passing in 1976 at age 83, 25 years after Woodbridge. And locomotive number 2445. They repaired it despite the extensive damage and put it back into service. It ran for 2 more years before being scrapped in September 1953. The K4s class lasted until 1957. Only 2 survive today out of 425 built. Pennsylvania designated them the official state steam locomotives in 1987. People call them a legend. But 85 people are gone because the railroad that operated them decided warning signals were too much trouble.